How do Mondstadt Archon quests stack up now that we're 5 years in? For a long time I've been tempted to experience it all over again, especially with Nesnaya just around the corner. After the Homeward event in version 6.4 brought such nostalgia for those early days, followed by the all too brief joy of exploring Dorman Port, I decided to see if Mondstadt might hit different now, with all the extra context I've picked up over the years. This has been long overdue. Before we get into it, I think it's worth revisiting what I thought the first time around and how I felt about it ever since. I always remembered the Mondstadt Archon quest as a bit of a chore I had to push through to get to the parts of the game I was excited to experience, and it wasn't until Sumeru that the story really pulled me in. The later regions left me frustrated at times, each for their own unique reasons, but even at their worst, I always thought them far more engaging than the opening to the story. What drew me into the game was the world, the music, the art direction, and the gameplay. I love exploration games, and Genshin really hit the spot. I was well and truly hooked from the first moment I heard that beautiful music take flight and saw Mondstadt's spectacular cliffs framing the lush landscape spread out before me, with the city of windmills turning in the distance. However, even though the premise sounded interesting, I was very underwhelmed by the story. The prologue's Find Your Lost Sibling spark felt sidelined almost immediately, and the Mondstadt plot, which took center stage, didn't carry the same personal weight, so I struggled to really care. I just wanted to go out and explore the world instead. Since then, my view was that the start of the story was something to tolerate between the parts of the game which were genuinely brilliant, and I always described the Mondstadt Archon quest as a fairly shallow, cliché story with underwhelming storytelling. However, many people love those opening acts. Some count them amongst their fondest memories across the entire game, and over the years I have come to love many of the characters these quests introduced. And I happen to love revisiting my favourite media, since the experience can be so different when you've got that extra context. So let's start with a recap of Acts 1 to 3 of the Mondstadt arc, then take a look at how well I think they work as an isolated story, then as an introduction to the wider tale which follows, and finally, how I personally felt about re-experiencing them this time around. Genshin starts with a very anime prelude. Twin travelers confronted by an unknown god who fights them between alabaster columns floating in the clouds. One twin is captured, the other continues to fight, but is overpowered and sent into darkness. Our power sealed away, we awaken in an unfamiliar land, unsure of how much time has passed. Our new companion, Paimon, suggests searching out the 7 gods of this world one by one to ask for any information which could help us find our sibling, starting with the god of the wind. As we make our way towards the nearby city of Mondstadt, we spot a huge dragon and a mysterious stranger. When they sense our presence, the stranger disappears and the dragon flies away in anger, leaving behind a strange red teardrop crystal. We continue on and meet Amber, an outrider of the Knights of Favonius, who escorts us to the city and gifts us a wing glider as thanks for fighting off some monsters. Before we can finish our test flight, the dragon Stormterror reappears and begins bombarding the city with violent winds and tornadoes. We get blown high into the sky and use an unfamiliar power to drive Stormterror away. Our heroics win the trust of Kaya, cavalry captain of the knights. He takes us to meet Jean, their acting grandmaster, who requests our help dealing with the leyline disruptions which have been fueling Stormterror's attacks, and grants us the title Honorary Knight after we complete our mission. We then run into the stranger from our first encounter with the dragon, who introduces himself as Venti the Bard. He has another teardrop crystal, and we discover that we can purify them using our otherworldly power. Venti claims the dragon's rage is due to it having been corrupted by the evil influence of the Abyss. He asks for our help retrieving the Holy Lyre de Himmel from the Favonius Cathedral so he can use its power to cleanse the dragon and save the city once and for all. Once we reach the cathedral, Venti just straight up asks for the lyre, claiming to be the Animo Archon Barbatus himself. Instead, he's dismissed as a madman. We try to use our status as Honorary Knight to grant us access, but that goes nowhere too. Undeterred, we try to sneak into the vault and liberate the lyre without approval, only to see a Fatui mage warp in and steal it just before we reach it. After escaping, we hide in a nearby tavern. The tavern's owner, Diluc, diverts some guards and then demands to know what happened. Venti explains. Diluc offers to use his network of contacts to help us find out where the Fatui took the lyre so we can steal it back. The following night, we meet again. Jean shows up as well to share a location of the Fatui stronghold and offer help with our quest in an unofficial capacity. We infiltrate the stronghold and retrieve the lyre, but its power has faded and it won't be able to cleanse the dragon yet. Unfortunately, the crystals we can purify replenish its power. The team splits up to find more crystals, then regroups to repair the lyre. Once its power is restored, we head to the Star Snatch Cliff together to summon Storm Terror. But as Venti tries to reason with it, an Abyss Mage appears and destroys the lyre, then manipulates the dragon into believing Venti is the enemy. The dragon flies away again, even more enraged, and it turns out that the leader of this faction of antagonists is none other than our sibling, though of course the Traveler does not know this yet. We regroup once more, and Diluc shares what he knows about the Abyss Order, while Venti admits that while he is the Anemo Archon, he is the weakest of the 7 and must rely on his people for help. We track down another Abyss Mage, and after defeating it, Venti notices some dark energy dissipating as it fades away. This hint shows him how to break the barrier which seals Storm Terror's lair, so we can now confront the dragon in its den. We fight through Abyss Order ambushes, climb to the heights of the ancient ruins, and take to the skies once more to battle Storm Terror, then shatter the crystals of corruption which have embedded themselves into its back, cleansing it of the Abyss's influence once and for all. In the aftermath, we return to the cathedral and return the battered lyre, much to Deaconess Barbara's dismay. Venti pretends to repair it with a touch of magic, though he admits to Traveler that it's merely an illusion. But then, outside the cathedral, we're confronted by an icy woman flanked by mages. Signora, the 8th of the Fatui Harbingers, has come to steal the Anemo Gnosis, a magical focus which lets the Archon resonate with Celestia, home of the gods. She brutally assaults Venti, takes his Gnosis, dismisses him as worthless, and leaves. After recovering, Venti explains the implications and urges the Traveler to seek the Geo Archon soon, because he only descends to the world once a year. And so we say goodbye to Mondstadt and set off towards Liyue. While I think it's more interesting to analyze how the Mondstadt arc functions as an introduction to the rest of the narrative, first, let's take a quick look at how well it works as its own isolated story. Normally, the beginning of a story has very specific goals, most importantly, to show what the wider story will be about and set up characters, world, and conflict. But in Genshin's case, it's also intended as the first complete chapter in an episodic narrative. Once the first 3 acts are done, we leave Mondstadt far behind. For that kind of episodic narrative to work, each episode should have its own self-contained and satisfying story, even if it does have some other specific function within the wider context. Hoyo have got this right in some of the later regions, but in Mondstadt, well... To start with the positive, one thing which surprised me is how well structured it all is from a high level. Act 1 establishes the world, the threat, and the characters involved, and we have a clear goal: save Mondstadt from Storm Terror by either killing it or cleansing it. Act 2 throws complications at us, one after another, raising the tension towards the story's darkest moment, where all our plans fail and the villains take the upper hand. Act 3 then sees us taking the fight to the dragon's lair itself, and we emerge victorious, though our triumph is tempered by a brief coda which sets up more future conflict. That's a solid outline, if a little basic and a little over-reliant on cliches. But cliches aren't always bad, and not every story needs an innovative structure. What matters is whether the story uses tropes and cliches in an engaging way, and whether it adds the depth which can make the familiar feel fantastic in the end. This clear narrative structure helps make Mondstadt feel pretty satisfactory for anyone who just wants a bit of light and harmless fun, but when you look for anything beyond the surface, things are a little less positive. Most disappointingly, for my personal preferences, every character is fairly flat. We get an impression of who each person is, but they're left static, with little nuance and no space for growth or change. Most are a caricature, rather than a character. Venti probably gets the closest to any depth, with the interesting tension inherent in the idea of God of Freedom, but it has little effect on the story aside from giving us an explanation for his actions, and its thematic potential is left untouched. Amber, Kaya, Lisa, Barbara, Jean, Diluc, all of the characters we meet have fascinating backstories and depth of character, but the Archon quests skim past them and focus on the immediate crisis instead. And the Traveler, of course, is a completely blank slate who kinda just exists. That's probably good for people who want to self-insert, but for the rest of us, it makes the most important role feel empty. All of that would be absolutely fine for the beginning of a story. Future chapters could use it as a foundation for everything that comes later, but for most of these characters, that potential is either fulfilled in a side quest or ignored entirely for a long time. There's a fair argument that perhaps that's an acceptable balance. Make the main quests be all action and leave the depth to the optional side stories. For me, that trade-off makes the main quests unsatisfying, and I can't help but look at all those other games which manage depth in both and wish Hoyo did it here. After all, they managed it in later regions. When it comes to the plot, while the sequence of events all makes sense, every step along the way, for me at least, is a step I've seen 100 times before, and more importantly, many of them feel contrived or overly convenient. The amount of in-world time it takes is tiny. Within a couple of hours of our arrival in the city, we're already hailed as a hero and given a position of inherent trust as an honorary knight, even though we literally just met everyone that day. People would be impressed by a strange outlander who came in and fought off a dragon, but I think they'd be a little wary too. The entire crisis is resolved within a couple of days, and by the end, we're already being treated as a longtime friend rather than the mysterious and powerful stranger we should have been. The closer you look at what actually happened, the more rushed it is revealed to be. It's competently put together, and it can be fun if you turn your brain off and just enjoy the ride, but when compared to top-tier open-world narrative games, it's very far behind. Many would argue that that's an unfair quality bar for a lowly gacha game. I have an entire video exploring why I disagree. And the presentation leaves a lot to be desired. There are a couple of decent cutscenes, especially the one for Venti's song, but outside of that, the cinematography is largely static and the dialogue is stilted and uses way too many words with almost zero room for subtext. The saving grace is the music, which is consistently gorgeous, plus personally, I still find the vibrant, cel-shaded aesthetic to be timeless. So, overall, my perspective on these first 3 acts remains the same. I'd still describe it as a fairly shallow, cliché story with underwhelming storytelling, and it's everything else about the game which made me love it in those early days. But before we get to those aspects, let's look at how this all works as an introduction to the wider story. The opening of any story has very specific goals which can make or break the narrative as a whole. If the opening fails completely, then it often doesn't matter how fantastic the later sections are, because too many of the people who gave it a try quit before it gets better. Key ingredients you'd usually expect to see are some kind of narrative hook, promises of the tone, genre and style, a fair amount of world building, and, most importantly, characters and conflict. The intent is to promise what the rest of the story will deliver, since that is what motivates the audience to continue engaging with it. Genshin's first scene functions as a prologue, something separate from the initial act which makes promises of its own. Prologues are useful because they provide a space for the story to make early promises which would not fit in the real opening of the story. For example, if you want to tell a sweeping epic about a desperate fight against an all-conquering Dark Lord bent on subjugating the world, but your story starts with a birthday party in a quaint, idyllic, rolling green countryside before it slowly introduces the wider conflict, a prologue can be vital for setting expectations. Genshin's prologue shows that this is a wide and unfamiliar world, with gods who take an active interest in events with whom we may find ourselves in conflict. The opening acts have a slower pace and a more local focus, but thanks to this prologue, we have the expectation that the story will build towards something grander and more epic in the long run. The prologue also gives our opening narrative hook. Our sibling has been taken from us, and we want to set out into the world to find them. I think this is a really good hook, but as I've said before, it was sidelined fairly quickly. The traveler gets swept up into more immediate events, and any urgency we might feel due to the strength of the prologue disappears early on. It does give the traveler an immediate reason to set out into Teyvat. We want to talk to each of the 7 Archons to seek answers about the unknown god we encountered in the hopes that this will lead us to our sibling, though of course this motivation changes fairly soon once we learn a little more. Even this early on in the story, one of the cutscenes shows a glimpse of our sibling, though the traveler is unaware that they're so close until a little later on. By the end of the Mondstadt arc, despite how irrelevant it felt to most of what happened so far, this hook remains a fairly strong motivation drawing the audience into the story. The arc as a whole also serves a clear template for what to expect in each of the regions the game explores. We turn up in an unfamiliar land filled with people to meet and places to explore, stumble into some kind of existential crisis which threatens its very existence, play a vital role in solving it, and then receive information and adulation in return before we move on to the next region. Combine that with the earlier promise that we'd journey to the 7 nations to ask for answers from the 7 Archons, plus the hints that we'd continue our journey afterwards, and even people who completely ignored everything outside of what they learned through the story itself would have a crystal clear outline for what to expect in the long term. It's interesting that the game diverged from this through the introduction of Not Cry while still retaining the same basic structure. Mondstadt also introduces 2 significant factions of antagonists, the Abyss Order and the Fatui. The Abyss Order come across as extremely generic villains with the cackling mages and transparently evil goals. There are some vague hints of something more to them when we begin to learn of their connection to Khaenri'ah, but for the most part, they have a distinct lack of depth. That glimpse of our sibling, however, is a clear promise. Even though the orders seem blankly evil to us now, the very person our protagonist is searching for appears to be their leader. Has our sibling turned to evil? And if so, why? If not, then we can expect a huge perspective shift to come our way. And the Fatui are kind of similar, yet more generic villains, though in this case they're presented as those stereotypical powerful evil diplomats with some nefarious goal which conflicts with our own. The most evocative aspect here is, of course, Signora and her introduction as the 8th of the Harbingers. She's comically evil, very much the kind of utterly reprehensible anime villain that people love to hate. While we don't see her power here, the ease with which she overpowered us and beat up Venti implies that she's pretty strong. The Harbinger title feels ominous, and the fact that there are 7 others who are more powerful and presumably more evil than her explains why so many people felt the Fatui were the most compelling part of Genshin for them. Even though I'm generally less enthused about villains than many seem to be, the promise they set up there was genuinely one of the best moments in Mondstadt. It tempts you to extrapolate from the little information you have and gives so much to look forward to. Mondstadt sets other smaller promises and expectations as well. The Traveler possessing powers beyond the expectations of this world, the good guys working outside the rules of law to achieve their goals, facets of the world building like Allogene's, Visions, or Venti's Gnosis. But the biggest expectation it set for me personally is actually one which turned out to be flatly incorrect. I felt this introduction was harmless fun, but also not all that interesting. It left me emotionally unaffected, and the hints of depth I saw in some of the concepts, themes, and characters were firmly relegated into side stories, in-world ephemera, or written backstories tucked deep into the game's labyrinthine menus. By the time we left Mondstadt, I expected the rest of the story to continue in that vein. I was happy to keep playing because of how much I loved the rest of it, but assumed I'd always be underwhelmed by the story. For a while, that expectation proved to be correct, though with some interesting caveats along the way. I guess that's part of why I was so enthralled when they finally managed to break that expectation. Before revisiting Mondstadt, I was curious how it would hold up now, given that the later regions have included vast improvements across all aspects of the game, and the competition in the open world gacha space has in some ways moved beyond what Genshin is able to offer. I expected some nostalgia, but that alone wouldn't hold my interest, and there was a good chance I'd end up dropping this idea entirely. After all, the story was the part I'd enjoyed the least the first time around. In the end, I didn't feel nostalgia for the story, and while I care about the characters involved a lot more than I did back then, I don't think it affected my perspective on the narrative. That probably won't kick in until I get to Sumeru. However, it was short enough that it didn't overstay its welcome, and the light tone helped it feel a breeze to play through rather than a chore. But what surprised me was how much the experience sparked that yearning to explore once more. Mondstadt might look a little basic compared to the later regions, but it's still beautiful in its own way, and with the utterly gorgeous music in the background, it just feels so enticing. The exploration is much more janky and rough around the edges. The early regions lack the convenient traversal mechanics added later on, you have practically no stamina at all, and this account also lacks any of the exploration quality of live characters. But that just kinda adds to the charm. I know these hills like the back of my hand. I have 100% exploration in every area on my main account after all, and I've trekked across them countless times in co-op after that. Yet this really does bring back those memories of just how much I loved exploring this world back when I first discovered it. Perhaps this time around it's better since I can just skim through without feeling the need to search out every single nook and cranny, but when played the way it was probably intended to be played, even the worst region in this game is an utter joy to visit. One point I was curious to see was the level of world building embedded into the Archon quests. Teyvat has an incredible depth of lore, and I've always argued that they did a very poor job of portraying it in the Archon quests. In an ideal world, I'd personally want the main story of a game to contain just enough context and explanation for everything in the main story to make sense, plus hints that there's more depth lurking out there in the world for those who want to find out more. That leaves space for the world to be more vibrant than can fit in the central narrative, while making sure the main story is at least coherent for those who don't explore further. Personally, when I encounter stories with that kind of setup, those hints at greater depth become compelling enough that I can't help but search for more. My ideal would be something like not Chrysar Conquests, but with the world quests from Natlan or Fontaine and the character stories from Liyue all consistently at their peak quality throughout the game. In Mondstadt, that first time around, I felt like far too little context made it into the story, so I struggled to care about large parts of the lore. The parts covered in the character stories and the most engaging of the world quests caught my interest, but the vast majority of it just faded into the background. When revisiting the story, I saw some fragments that I missed the first time around, but still feel it's all conveyed in a way which doesn't quite hit the mark for me. That disconnect is still there, even though this time around I'm already fully sold on the story they're trying to tell. Similarly, at this point, I've spent years with these characters, encountering them all across countless quests, hangouts, time-limited events, and so much more, so I have much deeper understanding of each of them. My feelings about their portrayal in the early Archon quest remains unchanged. With all the extra context, I can absolutely see that the parts they play in the story were all true to who they are, and the nuances of their personality came across in the events which happened, but I'd still argue that we get the surface level and no more. This feels particularly obvious in the contrast between how dynamic and varied the inter-character relationships feel in later regions and how static they feel in Mondstadt. I always felt this was something Hoyo really nailed for the first time in Sumeru, and they just took it to another level in Not Cry. In Mondstadt, these relationships exist, which helps create the impression that this is a real place you're visiting, but they remain unaffected by anything that happens. It's also worth touching on Paimon. Sometimes it feels like the general consensus is that she's a screechy annoyance from day one, and many complain that she spends all her time repeating anything the other characters just said to make sure the player is following the conversation. While I personally never minded her voice, one of the most surprising things about revisiting Mondstadt was that she didn't interrupt or repeat things, aside from maybe 1 or 2 occasions. The discourse about her had gaslit me into expecting her to be an utter nightmare to deal with, but she's way more of her own character than I remembered. I'm curious where this disconnect comes from. Maybe this was something they leaned into over time and she starts to get annoying in Liyue or in Azuma. Maybe this was more a problem in time-limited events, or perhaps in the world quests where Hoyo's writers aren't constrained by the cost of voice acting. Or maybe we're all just being gaslit by the people who disliked her voice. I guess I'll have to keep going so I can find out. It's also really interesting to see the differences in the early game experience which come from the steady stream of upgrades over time. While I still think they're shooting themselves in the foot by not adding improved traversal in the early regions, you do get access to other things very early on. The annual Pick a 5-star event is awesome to kickstart a new account, the ability to spend double resin saves a bunch of time, and they've smoothed out some of the difficulty spikes caused by poorly balanced challenges, for example. One improvement I have mixed feelings about is the lip syncing. Originally, they just didn't bother for the English voiceover, and it was one of those details which looked really bad when you happened to notice it, but which could mostly fade into the background. They've added full lip syncing now, but while it's definitely an improvement, it's still very underwhelming and feels far from natural. Sometimes people's mouths open way too far, and they look completely unhinged, so I think this still needs a fair amount of work. There are, of course, still countless quality of life improvements, which the game desperately needs for long-time players, and there are also many ways they could improve the early game experience. But overall, even in a market where there are more and more competitors vying for your attention, Genshin does still have a certain charm that can capture people who give it a chance. And finally, let's end with a little more discussion of that prologue. In hindsight, the promises it made have mostly been fulfilled. We've had a wide and varied world to explore, we've met many gods who take an active role in their world, and have already had conflict with some, and while we haven't reunited with our sibling permanently, we did meet them several times, and our continued journey serves a slightly more nuanced purpose, though that's for a different video. Aside from our true reunion, there are a couple more hidden promises which haven't been paid off yet. First, what is Paimon? Where did she come from? Why is everyone so blasé about the existence of a floating white fairy when there's nothing in the world like her at all? And second, we know little of the god who overpowered us with such ease, where they came from and what their motivations are, and how they tie into all the conflict we've encountered in our travels across Teyvat. Of course, many loreologists have pieced together hints, and we've started getting answers to the second in the last year or so, but in the main story it's been a long time coming. Hopefully, there's a satisfying payoff there. Mondstadt remains what it always was, a solid prologue which sets up many promises for the later story, and a smooth and inviting introduction which makes it easily accessible for newer players, but which never lives up to its potential, unable to convey the depth of lore and character which were written into its world, carried by its beautiful setting and incredible music. But while I can never say I'm a fan of Mondstadt's story, I can't help feeling drawn towards its deep sense of optimism and hope. Somehow, it instills that yearning for adventure, a wish to see a brand new world spread out before you and set out to uncover its secrets. So in spite of all its faults, I love it anyway. Genshin's ability to capture that elusive feeling is what makes it special, and on that point, Mondstadt is a brilliant beginning. Until next time!